He's author of a textbook on Chinese macroeconomy. A book was published a while ago, and he has just had a new edition released on Amazon. And today we are very happy to have Professor Schramm to share his insight from the book, and perhaps also invite him to use the framework in the book to comment on many important issues we are observing today. Professor Schramm has been also on the faculty of International Business Schools, IBSS in Suzhou, has been teaching at the CEIBS, China Europe International Business School, as Fulbright Scholar at the University of International Business and Economy in Beijing, taught in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and various other places. So someone who not only a very good economist, but have lived and taught and worked in China as well. So Professor Schramm, welcome to the event. Thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Shang-Jin, so much for moderating this, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Can I invite you to first to perhaps explain to our audience what have been the major developments in the Chinese economy over the last decade, and how your new edition has reflected these changes, please?
Yeah. Well, so thanks again, Shang-Jin and Athena, for organizing this event and agreeing to moderate it. And well, I guess one of the first things that's new is the book cover is new. So this is the old book cover, and this is the new book cover. And sometime in
and different title too, somewhat different title too.
Yeah, somewhat different title. And so the book will appear sometime on Amazon this month, and so that's exciting for me. But beyond the cover of the book, maybe one of the things that struck me most in writing the second edition is the vanguard, the amazing number of young Chinese scholars who have published articles, academic art, and top academic journals since I first published the book. So while I was publishing the first edition in 2015, there was a trickle, and Shang-Jin, you were actually at the lead of that group of young scholars. You have been, but now we have an explosion of publications by PhD Chinese students from top schools around the world publishing great articles. So it's made my work in summarizing their work, very easy, and I express some gratitude to them. Maybe for some context, I'll talk a bit about the first edition and what I call key drivers of the Chinese economy, and then how those have changed, and that will set out some context for the later question. So sort of as axioms or assumptions in the textbook, I argue that what makes China fundamentally different from other large economies are some key drivers, and one of them is its high savings rate. Another is the adaptability and flexibility of the labor force. Another is the role of the government. And then, of course, finally, the most obvious one is large population and level of employment. So all of these key drivers are still true, both from the first edition and second edition, but they've changed direction somewhat. Some of them have changed direction. So that, I think, is a context for some later ideas. The textbook continues to try and incorporate ideas from finance, not just macroeconomics, but from finance, tools from finance and accounting and even management to look at the Chinese economy. Now that's sort of a general look at what's new, but specifically, there are some things that have changed that are important. So for example, savings, China's national savings rate peaked in 2008. The size of the labor force peaked in 2017. These are all items that have become clear since the first publication. The service sector now is the largest sector of Chinese economy. China traditionally has looked at measuring GDP, in the traditional way, was to look at tertiary, primary, secondary sectors. And now the tertiary sector, the service sector, has surpassed China's manufacturing sector in size. Better measurements of GDP, so more information in terms of, we get information on quarterly GDP, although still there's some weaknesses in that area in terms of on the expenditure side. So on the production side, we have very good data quarterly. On the expenditure side, not so much. Then, another change in one of the chapters on the chapter on the balance of payments, I discuss where I discussed the balance of payments. While I was writing the textbook last time, there was a lot of discussion about the internationalization of the RMB. Well, since the problems in 2015, the summer of 2015, currency issues, loss of foreign exchange reserves, we hear less discussion about. So a step backward, I think, in that approach regarding international. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. China's, a major economy, the world's largest trader, still only represents something like 1% or 0.5% of the foreign currency market. So there's an inevitability to the internationalization of the RMB, but there's been a step back. Then in terms of what I call China's national balance sheet, there has been a transformation. It was very conservative, and now it's, we could say, less conservative in terms of China has close to $2 trillion in foreign currency debt. And that wasn't the case when I was writing the book. Then, of course, there's the Trump trade war, which is out of the blue from the new edition. And then another important area of difference relates to returns on capital. China's returns on capital have started to decline, and now actually approach returns on capital of the United States. So that is an interesting discussion in and of itself, but they've declined substantially. When I was writing the textbook, my estimates for using a variety of methods for returns on capital was something of the order of 19%. And now they're down closer to 10%. So a substantial decline on returns on capital. Of course, an area that now I understand you're interested in, Shang-Jin, the mobile banking digital transactions. That is, an incredible transformation since the first publication. Consumer credit has exploded. Most of it mortgage-related consumer credit, but nevertheless, new variety of vehicles and consumer credit. And then monetary policy steps forward in terms of reform, in terms of marketization, what we would call more market-based policies for monetary policy. There are many steps forward. I have a lengthy table on all the reforms that have occurred there. So those are just a sampling of some of the changes. And then I think I mentioned to you, finally, there's a new chapter on China's financial system. And actually, finally, I changed publishers. I self-published. The initial publisher was Taylor&Francis, and now I've decided to self-publish simply because it increases the publication speed by about a year.
Great.
And those are, I think, some of the things that maybe lay the ground for the discussion.
Great. For those who have just signed on to our event, we are having conversation with Professor Ron Schramm about his new macrofinance perspective on Chinese economy. My name is Jin Wei. I'm a professor of finance economics and Chinese economy at the Columbia University's Business School and School of International and Public Affairs. For those of you who have questions for Professor Schramm, you're welcome to leave questions in your chat box. Our staff will transmit the questions to us. Ron, since you mentioned, one of the developments in the last few years has been a rise of the service sector in the Chinese economy, and one of the very sort of very prominent sort of a signal of the rise of service sector, especially modern service sector, is the spread of a digital economy, digital payment, digital wealth management, and all of those areas. And just, in fact, today is November 5th. Yesterday was supposed to be the IPO of Ant Group, the Chinese fintech conglomerate. And that IPO was meant to be the largest IPO in world financial history. Of course, their IPO has been suspended by Chinese regulators. So I wonder whether you can share your insight with us, both about the rise of fintech as a particular segment of the service sector in the Chinese economy, and what you read into the Chinese authorities' suspension of the IPO of Ant Group.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic, and this Ant Financial is sort of really right at the very vertex of that discussion. It's very interesting. About 10 years ago, one of the faculty at UIBE and I, Lin Guijin, and I published an article on China's flow of funds and where China's funds went, how they were used, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, we estimated that about a third of China's savings we just couldn't account for. There was no paper trail. And so what has happened since then has been an explosion of institutions, both big and small, which have filled in that space. So the good news sort of is that now there is a paper trail, because now there are actual institutions that are intermediating, the peer-to-peer lending, for example. We have documentation and data about that. So that's in some ways the good news. A vacuum was filled. But the bad news was that many of these institutions have created problems and questions of financial stability within China. And so one of the big changes since I've first published the book is that so-called shadow bank, that segment of the shadow banking sector was growing at the time I last published the book. But since then, between 2015 and now, the Chinese authorities have cracked down on these types of institutions. Now, every country has a shadow banking sector. There's nothing wrong with the shadow banking sector.
The US does too, yeah.
The US does too, even larger, much larger than China's. Yeah. So
different kind of shapes, different kind of forms. Yeah.
That's right.
Shadow banking,
and so it's a hedge fund in the US, for example, would be part of the shadow banking sector here. And in China, Alibaba and Alipay, which started Alipay, I'm sure you're all familiar with Alibaba, which is basically an online market, and then Alipay, which was a way of parking funds in a money market fund at higher returns than what the traditional banks could offer. And then eventually Ant Financial became a much bigger organization, actually making loans. And so all of these types of activities very much started to compete with the big four banks, the traditional banks. And meanwhile, the regulators had this ambivalent, very true in the tradition of, I think, Chinese policymakers, an ambivalent view about these things. On the one hand, they saw it as promoting growth, providing quality loans, providing information about creditworthiness, so on and so forth. So this ambivalent attitude. But on the other hand, a little bit worried in terms of, what types of loans are being made, or what's the quality, what are the quality of these loans? And then more importantly, are these institutions causing financial disintermediation among the big four banks. So there's this ambiguity about promoting growth and making better loans, and then about the risks involved and the risk of financial disintermediation. One of the charts, so this is a long way of getting to your answer, and I apologize for it, but I just wanted to give some context. One of the charts that I have in the text shows shadow banking as a share of, shows cumulative savings versus what's being deposited in Chinese traditional banks, what we call financial institutions. And that has been on the decline. So savings, less and less are being put into these, and between the time I last published the book and this time, now less than half of China's savings are within the traditional banking sector and are more being handled by institutions like Ant Financial. Now, what Ant Financial says is they say, well, we're just intermediating between banks and good borrowers. We're not acting as a bank, we're just intermediating. Of course, that raises the immediate question about, well, how much capital does Ant Financial have? How much skin does it have in that game? Because if it's simply intermediating someone else's money, there's an inherent risk. So we don't really know specifically why the crackdown. We don't know that answer. What the Chinese regulatory authorities, the CSRC, says is Ant wasn't fully transparent in providing information about what its underlying business. That's a very interesting statement in and of itself, because just this year, the Chinese regulatory authorities moved away from the regulatory framework for IPOs to what was called the registration system, whereby the registration system allows more market forces, the exchanges to determine who gets to list, and basically the regulatory authorities said, we have our hand, you just follow some simple rules, and you provide information. If you provide information, we have a hands-off approach. So now, of course, the only regulatory hook that they have is to say, you didn't provide enough information. And I'm sure you could say that to any financial institution going into an IPO anywhere around the world. But this is the reason that's stated, and it fits in very much with the recent reform this year going to a registration system. But my suspicion, of course, is that there are issues about Alibaba making peer-to-peer lending or bank-to-peer lending without skin in the game, perhaps, and also the issue of financial disintermediation within the bank. So that's sort of a long story. I guess the end of the story is I really don't know. I don't think anyone does except the regulators. But the context, I think, is pretty clear.
I mean, the official reason is that on November 2nd, 3 days before the IPO, the regulators has issued a draft regulation on in the industry in which and the group is in particular, potentially new capital requirement, and potentially new restrictions on geographic reach of lenders like Ant Financial and the group. Therefore, the Ant Group's previous IPO perspectives no longer has the accurate disclosure, therefore needs to be revised. That's sort of the reason. So in terms of a legal base for this, in principle, this does not violate the Shanghai Stock Exchange's so a new way of issuing IPO, but the disclosure is no longer accurate. I guess that's the legal basis. I want to ask you a question about whether you think, you mentioned that one of the major changes in the last few years is a change in the saving rate, national savings rate. Savings as a share of GDP has been declining, and one of the key drivers has changed. Do you have a view on role of a fintech in that change in the savings rate? Like, does fintech contribute to a decline in savings rates, or savings rate would have changed anyway, regardless of this. Like the one particular potentially concrete example channel for fintech to contribute to a decline in savings rate, some people alleged, is that fintech, by say offering consumer loans, have greatly facilitated households' ability to consume, before they consume out of their future income. Like previously, where credit cards was not very well, was not widespread, and households have very limited ability to consume beyond their means, so to speak, cannot borrow against future income. The fintech essentially facilitate people to do that, and therefore this might lead to a reduction in savings rate. I wonder whether that's a way, or one of the concerns that the regulators have expressed. So I wonder whether you think that kind of view is right or not. A, and B, whether declining savings rate is a good thing or bad thing, regardless of whether the role of a fintech in this.
Yeah, it's a. I like your angle on this, because it's an interesting angle. Yes, I think consumer finance and the digitization of consumer finance is helping boost consumption. And this also ties in with this notion of the service sector becoming the largest sector, because we don't measure, China doesn't measure very well the service sector, either as the digital part, nor even just outright services aren't captured in consumption. So consumption, this consumption statistics may be missing this, and so savings may decline. So on one hand, but what I thought you were going to suggest, first of all, when you mentioned that, was that the mobile banking, for example, where you can, where banks traditionally did not want very small deposits, and what the genius of Alipay and Ant Financial was to aggregate these small deposits via the cell phone, via the mobile phone, so that you could deposit funds into one of their money market funds, which then would be deposited at a better rate within the banking system, because Alibaba and Ant Financial had a greater bargaining power with the financial institutions. So it was this electronic aggregation. So on one hand, yes, it spurred consumption, but you could also argue, in terms of providing better service and better interest returns, it would also spur consumption. My view is that while the consumer sector and the discussion of consumer behavior is fascinating, and you've, of course, done very important work in this area, what is also important is corporate savings. And so I think one big part of the picture of the decline in China's national savings is that enterprises have become less, their returns are falling, they've become less profitable. And just like in the United States, enterprises contribute most of the nation's savings. The average Chinese citizen maybe is only 20 to 30% savings rate. So that can't possibly explain the large savings rate that China has. So I think the digitization is contributing to a decline in personal savings, but I think there's also something on the business side going on where corporate profits have been on the decline, especially with all of the problems starting from the financial crisis, the Trump trade war, increased competition, so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Corporate savings as a share of gross savings is very large. The Chinese corporate sector saving actually does stand out relative to US and other countries in the following way. US and other G7 countries for quite a while, corporate sector on net has been a saver. So that is corporate net savings rate is positive, whereas the Chinese, for perhaps 3 or 4 decades, corporate sector on net has negative savings. The corporate liability is always bigger than its assets. It's not just in the last 5 years. It's true even when Chinese current account surplus was very big. On the this saving investment balance, your book has spent quite a bit of space on this, and you also pointed out that the Chinese current account surplus has been shrinking very dramatically to, used to be like 10% of GDP in its peak to not that far from 0%. So and what does it mean for Chinese economy, and what does it mean for US and the rest of the world, Ron?
Yeah, my view is that while there's much short-term discussion about the trade war created by Trump, really at the fundamental level, the tension between China and the United States relates to our differences in savings rates. And it's the simple accounting identity that savings minus investment equals the current account balance. And if a country like China, which has a very high savings rate, doesn't invest that much, it invests a lot, but not enough to match its high savings rate, it will have a large current account balance. And for the US, where the savings is, let's say, maybe 18% of savings rate is maybe 18% of GDP in a good year, we don't save enough. So I think to answer your question, as China's savings rate declines, and I believe it will inevitably decline, it's inevitable as consumption starts to grow, and there are many reasons, including reasons that you have offered. The younger generation, which has never experienced all the turmoil that the older generation has less of a precautionary reason for savings. And so China's savings rate inevitably will decline. And I think that will put a little bit in China's, and another reason, of course, is that China's savings rate will decline and consumption will go up, is because the Chinese authorities want that to happen. And that's all part of this notion of rebalancing and dual circulation. And so one of the key drivers for the Chinese economy is the role of the government. And if they want this to happen, they will promote policies for it to happen. So all of these things, I think, will put a little less pressure on the current account and trade balance, because both countries now are really looking more internally and doing things to generate more internal demand and internal supply. And in the US, we've experienced a lot of uncertainty, whether it be the financial crisis, COVID, whether it be the Trump presidency. And I think that will enhance the precautionary motive for the younger generation to save more. That, on the other side of the coin, will put less pressure on our trade relationship as each nation saves more. The unknown, though, that as I've been thinking about it, is that the Biden new administration says one of its main goals is infrastructure spending, so huge increases in investment. That will move us in the other direction, and I think that will be an interesting political discussion as the US wants to delve into greater infrastructure spending. You need steel. In some cases, you need steel for that. And who makes steel and who has an excess supply of steel? China. Are we going to reopen steel factories in the United States? And Pennsylvania has been a major steel producer. So that will be will the political weight be in favor of buying from the cheapest provider, the lowest cost, which would be China, or buying from more expensive but domestic suppliers? So I think there's some uncertainty there on that end. But on the investment side, there's still this issue. But on the saving side, I think both countries are moving in the right direction. And to answer your earlier question, yes, I definitely think China saves too much, and it's a good thing for China to save less.
The Chinese government has announced this so-called dual circulation as its guiding strategy going forward. What does dual circulation mean? What does this? What will this do for China, and would this be welcomed by the United States?
Yes, I I I I find the at least part of the notion dual circulation sort of a rebranding of the term rebalancing. I guess rebalancing sounds too much like you're out of balance. So why should you need to rebalance? So maybe dual circulation has a better tone to it. But basically, the notion that China's consumption is not high enough, that it's relying too much on exports, and that investment is too large a part of the economy, and therefore it has to rely more on producing and demanding. Basically, dual circulation at one level means producing and demanding its own goods. So I think from the US perspective, the Chinese, at least at first level, that sounds like a good plan, because the US has always been focused on our current account deficit with China. We may regret that as China's domestic demand picks up and we find that those Chinese goods are no longer affordable or available. We may, but the U.S. has been running large current account deficits, which, in my view, are not sustainable over the long run. There are others would argue the other way, that basically we're getting free loans, free financing. I'm not convinced of that. The other part of dual circulation is basically more a focus on self-reliance, and again a rebranding. So instead of China 2025, which got a lot of bad press politically, and I think the Chinese authorities decided was a bad idea. It basically said the US has a target on its back, China 2025. So the rebranding now is no longer China 2025, it's a 15-year plan. And I think the 15-year plan basically has the same idea, is to make great progress in innovation and technology. That, I think, again, for China is something that is, the policymakers are quite adept at understanding. It's, for me to explain China's problems is one thing, but policymakers, they understand their own problems very well. And in this case, it's right on target. China's key drivers of savings, as we've discussed, and investment are on the decline. Its labor force is on the decline. And in some type of solo growth framework, these are key drivers for economic growth. And so the drivers are moving in the wrong direction. And so what does China need to promote growth and to create a middle-class society? It needs technological progress. That's the last leg that it can rely on to promote growth. And I think this dual circulation is, again, focusing on that need for technological progress. The concern I have is that when Chinese authorities think of technological progress, they think of plant, property, equipment, they think of engineering solutions. It's a very engineering mentality, a very hardware mentality. And what I hope for China is that when they think of technological progress, they also think of better human resource management, better improved opportunities for education, more focus on health and human capital. All of these are just as important as the engineering solutions. And you don't hear very much about that when you hear of China 2025, or when you hear 15-year plans. You still hear a lot about targets, although maybe we'll talk about it later, but in various 5-year plans, we see that the tone there is changing. in the direction of more human capital enhancement.
This leads naturally to the question about the role of government in the economy. Another key driver that you mentioned in your book. How do you see the role of government has changed? In the last decade or so, and you mentioned about some changes in the tone in the 5-year plans. What are the changes do you observe, and are they desirable changes or less desirable changes?
Yeah, I think what I do in the textbook is I compare the United States' own 5-year plan, which really doesn't have a 5-year plan. It's the economic report of the president, which almost no one reads, and China's 5-year plan, which I think almost everyone reads and knows and understands. And it's pretty remarkable in China. It seems to me how the message from the top authorities get down even to the universities I was at. They understood what their part was in the 5-year plan, and that's very impressive. What I think has changed for both countries is traditionally China's 5-year plans have focused very much on targets of output, all about supply, bushels of wheat, apartment units to be constructed, even what the lifespan should be increased by, which I think in the last one was increased by 1 year. Very hard to control that. I wish I could control that. But in the 13th and what sounds like the 14th 5-year plan, now we hear more aspirational goals, things about enhancing the social safety net, improving environment, increasing educational opportunities. There's still numerical, improving health and welfare. There's still numerical targets there. So many more kilometers of rail needs to be constructed, things like that. But there has been a shift, I think, especially starting in the 13th 5-year plan, and now more so on the 14th, toward a softer, gentler approach. And that's basically facing the new reality that China's returns on capital have declined. And so, more investment is not going to solve China's problems of growth, but more enhancement in human capital will. Meanwhile, on the other side, on the United States side, under the Trump administration, the economic report of the president, you hear more sounding like China, which is, enhanced production. They talk a lot about infrastructure and so on and so forth. And Biden will talk a lot about infrastructure. These are all supply side things where traditionally the economic report of the president has focused very much on demand, consumption, keeping consumption high, keeping housing investment high, sort of things like that.
Like you said, that the 5-year plans and other government plans tend to have a mixture of some things about aspirational, things you hope to happen, other which may or may not involve directly government doing something. Others are targets which have additional government actions that go with it. I mean, in a way, I don't know the U.S. analogy necessarily will be the ERP, the president's economic report by the president, which, like you said, no one reads. But every president's State of Union address or inauguration address also declare a bunch of aspirational goals, sometimes numerical goals, right? And Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NIH, NSF also actually put real resources, taxpayer money, behind certain activities to nudge the economy going in the same direction, rather than just let laissez-faire to take place. Now, arguably, the Chinese does this much more than the US. So I wonder whether you can give us some idea about those 5-year plans collectively has been a good, that involve resource allocation nudged by the government. Are they unbalanced a good thing? Make the Chinese economy healthier, more, going better, closer to societal's aspiration, in other words, correcting some market failures? Or are they just a sign of intervention in the economy, relics of planned economy, therefore unbalance have created more distortions, more problems than good. Do you have, yeah?
And your question is about is it about
like a 5-year plans? The fact that China has a sequence of 5-year plans, and the 5-year plans sometimes seems to play a role in resource allocation. Is this a good thing, correcting market failures, or is it a bad thing, adding distortions to the economy, unbalanced? Like
yeah. Well, I think it's a mix of things, and I think the notion of public goods, right, to the extent that the 5-year plans set goals for infrastructure, for example, rail or airports or subways, to the extent that these are public goods, it seems to me that they're a good thing. But then when it starts moving down deeper into the woodwork, into concrete production or steel production, or then I think it becomes problematic, and that I think happens more, maybe less with the actual 5-year plan, but then with the updates of the 5-year plan as things change, and every year they update it and say, oh, we see this industry has. So then it becomes very political. It becomes less economic and more about political favors. It seems to me, and does create real problems. On the aspirational side, though, I think it's a good thing, all around, because China's, as I discuss in the book, and as various IMF reports provide, China ranks very low in terms of providing public welfare, the social safety net. It ranks very, very low. And so to the extent that it's at least stating these as aspirations, it's a good thing.
Your book also talk about the Trump trade war. I wonder whether you can give our audience a sense about whether you think the trade war has been good for the Chinese economy or not, and whether trade war has been good for the U.S. economy, U.S. households and firms or not. And we might have a new president, hopefully we'll know soon. Would you advise the new administration to manage trade relationship with China differently or not?
Yeah, well, I think
the small questions.
I think that again, in the broad context, the trade war is an uphill battle because our savings rates are so different, and so you're basically fighting against some basic accounting rules, which say each country is going to have a current account imbalances in guided by how much they save. So I think that for China in some ways it's been a good thing in the sense that while there has been some short-term pain perhaps in China for those particular industries which have been affected by tariffs, it's nudging China in the direction of where it wants to go anyhow, which is away from reliance on exports as a source of employment. And it certainly has enough foreign exchange already. So it nudges it toward what the Chinese want, which is this so-called rebalancing or dual circulation. That being said, we economists always think that trade is a good idea. So when you impose tariffs, you usually impose them for the wrong reason, for political reasons, for industries that are dying in your country. You tend to protect industries that are dying in your country anyhow. And unless you have a strong strategic trade argument, which is that you are sure that, let's say, the semiconductor industry or the artificial intelligence industry or the robotic industry is a winner, if unless you're convinced of that, then imposing trade sanctions is really a problem. It just creates distortions. So the point I would make is that the trade war by Trump is really a battle against something which is inevitable. Both countries are going to have current account imbalances one way or another. It may be with different countries. And for the US, I think it simply has perhaps caused some misallocation of resources here and perhaps some price distortions as well.
China was on a path of shrinking current account surplus and trade surplus as a share of GDP. Ironically, in the last few years, in the years of trade war, Chinese bilateral surplus against the US has increased,
yes.
Not declined. So both Chinese exports and imports have declined, but the imports have declined more than exports. So in a way, at least to the extent President Trump cared about the numerical target, it didn't quite achieve what it promised American people that it will get. But that may or may not be the only the right place to look. I wonder whether you would advise, if we have a new administration, would you advise new administration to manage the trade relationship differently or not?
Well, the tariffs have, as you know, the tariffs haven't really been reduced by either country that were put in place. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a very interesting negotiation between China and the United States about removing those tariffs. And and also thrown into that mix will be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an Obama administration initiative, which for political reasons was never fully pushed, and now may come back to life. And so the Chinese, the U.S. has some good negotiating chips, and so do the Chinese. And I think the relationship will improve. Will definitely improve because we'll be negotiating in some rational way about, rather than increasing tariffs, we'll be negotiating about decreasing tariffs with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier, in the United States building up, and our need for Chinese goods and products for infrastructure development. So I think both sides have some things to give and some things to take. So in some ways, I'm optimistic. The only thing that I would, well, there are several things I'd be cautious about, but there's some nice academic studies which I cite in the book, which show the effect that the long-lasting effect of uncertainty and what on trade and exports, and how firms who are in the export sector are very hesitant to make a commitment, and this is sort of what, and technically a real options approach, are hesitant to make any type of commitment when there's that much uncertainty. And what the trade war has done now is create a lot of uncertainty, and that may sort of still be a problem for our trading relationship. The caution on each side. So it'll take some time to heal, I think.
One of the very interesting features of your book is to apply, tools from corporate finance to macroeconomic questions that one doesn't see very often in macroeconomic books. So I wonder whether you can share, some thoughts with us about what does one learn from their kind of approach that one will not get from standard macro approach. Ron.
Yeah, I sort of, as a graduate student in economics, I sort of grew up on a strong diet of rational expectations and perfect foresight models, which I then became very tired of. And so I was trying to take a different look at macroeconomics from its roots, and macroeconomics really has its roots in accounting, GDP accounting, if you think about it. So it really opened my eyes and made me ask more questions. So I look at, for example, the current account as the fundamental cash flow of a country. And I had never really thought about it that way, and looking at the balance of payments as the financial, the accounting cash flow. So one is an accounting cash flow and one is and so it asks questions is, why does the United States have, as an operating concern, why does it have a negative cash flow? And is that sustainable, even though perhaps it has, on an accounting side, a positive cash flow? And then I try to ask questions about China's investment. And there you take a real options approach. And the question is has real options basically are questions about when do you pull the trigger? Do you wait for an investment? Do you make the investment now or do you wait? And if you make the investment now, what's the cost of making it now, given that you have an option to delay? And so I think about all of China's investments and ask questions about, has China pulled the trigger in its urge to respond to external shocks? And again, this gets me back to this notion of rebalancing and all of that. China's macro policy very much has been responsive to external shocks, whether it be going all the way back to the 1981 dot-com bubble all the way to the great financial crisis. Whenever those things happen, if you look at China's investment picks up. That's completely opposite from what you would see in the United States, where during any type of recession or financial crisis, investment falls. So the government basically is pushing out this investment. And the question is, has all of this investment been creating value? Issues of quality of growth, or are some of these investments down the road bad investments? And one example of this question of applying financial tools to macro is to think about high-speed rail in China. While remarkable and wonderful, many of the academic studies that look at high-speed rail conclude that it's great because GDP in that particular province where high-speed rail occurred went up when high-speed rail occurred. To me, that's a tautological argument. Of course, GDP is going to go up because high-speed rail is part of GDP. But that's not the question. The question really is, has that investment in high-speed rail over the next 15 or 20 or 30 years, will that yield positive returns from a societal point of view, or was it a bad investment? And that's a very different question from asking, did high-speed rail increase today's GDP? And so taking a finance approach helps you, I think more deeply about some of these macro issues.
So has high-speed rail system investment yielded positive returns?
I don't know. Only time will tell. But it certainly has, without a doubt, all of the academic studies show it's increased current GDP. But that is the same as saying General Motors for 40 years built up its asset base and built up sales, but at the end of the day went bankrupt. The question is, can a country be like a company? Can it make a lot of bad investments that ultimately don't pay off?
I guess the difference is people think about infrastructure projects as an input into firms' production. So that makes it different from other kind of investments, right? So the idea is that high-speed rail and highways are something, because the returns are external. It's not just how much money, how much revenues you get from selling high-speed rail tickets, but could other firms' productivity be raised as a result of having better connectivity? And that make it the analogy potentially somewhat different from just evaluating firm level investments. There's an externality component to it, and I guess whether this is a good project or not depends on a careful analysis of size of the externalities compared to the cost. Right. So okay. So you also your book also has an interesting discussion about the public finance system in China. For someone who understands the way public finance works in the US, can you give us some contrast between the public finance system in the two countries, and maybe also enlighten us on what those differences mean for outsiders, international investors or international firm, in understanding the way Chinese economy works. Ron.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Shang-Jin, sort of a landmark year related to public finance in China was this 1994 reform of how taxes were distributed between the central government and the localities, where basically the central government wanted to have greater control over tax revenues. And so a formula was created to divvy up how, once the tax revenues are collected, how much localities get, for example, for the value-added tax, or for the corporate tax, or for the personal income tax, and how much the central government gets. So a strict formula of dividing it up every year after year. The problem with that, though, was that while the amount of tax revenues were apportioned in some, reasonable way, the burden of expenditures was heavily placed on localities. And so the localities, which in principle in the past could not borrow directly, just like states in the United States are often prohibited from borrowing on their own, were put in a real bind because many of the expenditure burdens, and so I think it's something like 78% of expenditure burden is on localities, while something like 40 or 50, I don't remember the exact number, 40 to 50% of the tax revenues are allocated, about 50% of the tax revenues are allocated toward localities. So there's this huge gap. So that's one problem, and also sort of that problem. And so in the United States, we don't have at least that problem. There's basically a pretty good balance for localities and states, at least pre-COVID. There's a pretty good balance between their tax revenues and property tax revenues and so on and so forth, and expenditures. This, by the way, is, one could view it as roots. That 1994 law was, in some sense, the roots of China's modern shadow banking system, because then localities found clever ways to borrow by creating off-balance sheet entities which could borrow on behalf of local governments. And that, in effect, was really the start of China's modern shadow banking system. So it was an important change of laws and regulations. But another major difference in terms of how funds are allocated is that in China, the central government allocates down to the provinces, and then the provinces down through a negotiated process, which would be a very interesting discussion. I wish I were in one of those dinners where everyone is drinking and discussing, how much money do I get from the province if you're some local mayor. Those must be interesting. So then there's this negotiation between the provinces and the localities as to how much. But the point is that the money is allocated to other government entities in China, by and large. While in the United States, when we do revenue sharing, a lot of it is, in effect, directly to individuals. So it might be for Medicare payments or welfare payments or unemployment benefits. It's to individuals. This, of course, ties very much in with the problem of consumption in China, because if you're allocating in China revenue sharing to localities and provinces, what do they do with those funds? They try to meet the 5-year plan. And what does the 5-year plans typically say? It says we need more roads, more investment, more building. While in the United States, when you allocate to consumers, well, what do consumers do who receive unemployment benefits or welfare benefits or whatever? They consume. So it very much ties in with our own fundamental problems of the United States not perhaps saving enough, and consumption level that may be high, and China's problem of overinvesting. So both countries, I think, could learn from each other, really, in terms of how funds are allocated from the central government revenue sharing, in effect, it seems to me.
The way tax revenues are collected and then used are very different between the two countries. In terms of a rise of shadow banking, in the data, it seems like there's a big role of the stimulus program of 2009 and 2010 in response to the declining external demand for Chinese goods after global financial crisis. That seems to, there's a much, I think the local governments were not allowed to borrow formally, and the rise of those so-called local borrowing platforms that tended to come out right after 2009, 2010 or so. Now, another aspect of public finance is composition of expenditures. You contrasted some of those differences in expenditure items between two countries. I mean, in the U.S., we are on the verge of having the Obamacare repealed if a president gets reelected, and together with the composition of the Supreme Court, we might very well see that particular piece of social safety net be dramatically changed. China doesn't have quite the same kind of discussion, but the overall level of social safety net is less generous than US, which means it's even much less generous than countries in Europe. Do you see? So I want to invite you to comment about that aspect of expenditure composition. Like, do you see a need for China to ramp up the social safety net, having more publicly funded healthcare program, having more publicly funded social security or pension program? Should China move towards the US model, or should China think about some other countries' system as its model?
Yeah, well, it's what I was most struck by. I think one of the things I was most struck by in writing about China's social safety net is actually how broad it is, how many people are covered. Well over 80 to 90% of the population are covered by some form of health insurance and some type of pension. So the breadth is very impressive, except for there's one exception, which is unemployment insurance, where that highlights the sort of, I guess we could call it still informal employment, or individual proprietors who would not have access. So there are so many people in that category so the unemployment insurance does not have that same breadth as health and pension. The problem is with across the board on the benefit side of all of these, and this was something I learned as I wrote the book, is that there's a lack of depth. So as you said, what individuals actually receive is quite small, and in the case of healthcare, barely worth mentioning in terms of the benefits. They may be covered, but the cash payment wouldn't in no way cover the actual healthcare out-of-pocket costs for anyone who was not covered. So now on the revenue side for these, particularly another thing that I learned, particularly with regard to social security and healthcare, is that the tax that is paid is among the highest around the world. So the contribution rates are incredibly high, very painful. And the reason for that is because
often 40% of the payroll.
Yes, it's amazing, and there's and this is because of legacy issues that the programs were implemented fairly recently in combination with actuarial problems of an aging population. So those two factors combine in order for these funds to be viable with such a vast population. The contribution rates, there's a huge penalty on society's current working population to cover these imbalances. So to answer your question, it seems to me that China could move closer toward international norms in terms of providing benefits. And China certainly has enough savings. And so the question is, does it have the political will to tax those savings in some way, shape, or form in order to transfer those savings into making transfer payments to members of society for healthcare? And again, it goes back to the notion that the 5-year plan is wonderful and all of that in terms of setting out targets, but these aspirational targets of human capital, I think, are really important. So I think if the authorities couch the argument as a growth story, if we enhance our human capital, we'll be more productive. Then it's an easy sell, it seems to me.
Chinese government expenditure, the share of GDP, is something like a 20% that includes both social safety net, health expenditure, and discretionary spending. In contrast, U.S. shares 30% percent. So U.S. has a larger government than China as a share of GDP by their measure. And of course, European countries have even higher share, closer to 50%. Some of them have over 50%. So China is comparatively smaller government, mostly driven by a much smaller social safety net. On the other hand, if one look at government expenditure, the share of GDP across 180 countries rather than compared to high income countries, there's a very strong association between income level and relative size of government. Richer countries have larger governments than poorer countries. If we compare China to other countries at a comparable income level or poorer country, Chinese government, the social safety net is no smaller on average. So I guess the question is, should China benchmark itself to other countries at a similar income level, developing countries, or should China benchmark itself to a richer country like US or Europe? I don't know whether you have views on this.
Well, I don't know if I don't know I don't know what the right balance is for China. It seems to me the Chinese in spirit and law are closer in some ways in terms of social welfare seems to be closer in spirit maybe toward the Europeans in some ways, and so maybe they'll move in that direction. One of the things that I haven't really talked about, but it's in this context, is that China's disposable personal income is low by international standards. So if you're talking about social welfare, the biggest step is not really by the government in terms of its expenditure on transfer payments. It's by allowing disposable personal income to rise as a share of GDP. It's something like 50, 53, 54% of GDP in the United States. It's closer to 70% of GDP. And so there's a great imbalance between corporate income in China and household income. And so again, this is a question of taxation or a question of perhaps taxation and transfer, or a question of regulation in terms of allowing labor unions to become more powerful perhaps and negotiate stronger wages. So I think even before China moves forward on the social safety net, it might want to think about what it can do to enhance. I mean, that's very much in China's style, isn't it? To have the individual take care of themselves. And so they can actually do that perhaps if their disposable personal income rises.
Great. On the Chinese banking sector regulation, you use the term entanglement of regulation. What do you mean by that term, and what does it imply for the efficiency of Chinese financial system, Ron?
Yeah, well, the Chinese banking system is heavily regulated, and there are many requirements placed on banks. And so, of course, they're going to have trouble competing with someone like Ant Financial, which may not have reserve requirements, and banks do. So banks have, for example, the Basel requirement, a capital requirement. Now they have a maximum loan to deposit ratio requirement. They also have a reserve requirement. They also have requirements related to lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. And so there are a host of requirements. And what I try to do in the textbook and what I call a case study is show if these requirements are consistent. And mathematically, you can show that it would be impossible for at least the technical, if not even including the non-technical requirements, but the technical requirements about meeting a certain loan deposit ratio or certain reserve requirement, that it would be impossible actually for banks to meet these requirements.
Can you give an example in this area?
Well, for example, this is why banks have in the past moved back and forth between, on their asset side, what they call a loan and what they call an investment. So at one point, they don't meet. They may meet a reserve requirement, but they don't meet the loan to deposit requirement. So they have to shift out of the loan, what's called a loan, into an investment account. And then at the end of the month, they shift back into the lending account. And so the only way they can actually meet the requirements is by very creative accounting shifts. And this in itself has contributed, I think, to the shadow banking sector, to the allowance for example, the establishment of trusts and off-balance sheet items for banks, which the regulators are dealing with. So that, I think, the banks basically are in a very tough position, are over-regulated. And there's an inconsistency there.
So some of the regulatory measures put in place now in international literature have acquired the name of macroprudential measures. It's a very nice sounding, benign sounding term. When you look at the Chinese banking sector regulation, would you consider, what kind of measures would you consider belonging to the category of macroprudential measures? And what kind of things do you think of just consequence of bureaucratic incompetence that should have been gotten rid of?
Yeah, I think, for example, the loan to deposit ratio is, a bank should stand on their own 2 feet and have capital at risk and decide on what loan deposit ratio is reasonable. To impose one, I think, creates an additional burden. And then, of course, all the targeting for industries, which still occurs, supporting particular industries with loans is not a technical explicit regulation, but is a non-technical implicit regulation. So those are problems. And then, of course, we haven't even talked about the interest rate ceilings and floors, which technically have been removed, but in fact are still in place. And these were created as a cushion for banks to become profitable after the China's what I call China's silent banking crisis of 2000, 2003. And so the interest rate ceilings and floors were put in place to create a cushion of profits for these banks. One of the distortions that this in itself causes is it does make firms profitable artificially. But then
makes them
artificially profitable, but then that allows the Basel requirement to be met with great ease, because the Basel requirement is a requirement related to equity and capital of the firm, and their equity and capital is high artificially, which means then that they can lend even more. So these problems have second order effects, which are really bad.
Okay. One of the changes that we see out of China in the banking space was a merger of banking regulators and insurance regulators. So the former, Chinese Banking Regulatory Commission and Chinese Insurance Regulatory Commission have been made into a single commission. And one of the motivations was to address the shadow banking problems, because previously it was said that the banks, financial sector, and private sector are very creative. They created products that insurance regulators thought it was not part of their business to regulate, and the banking regulators thought it was not part of it. So more precisely, so insurance company can create products that are essentially banking products. But since insurance companies formally report to the insurance regulators, they don't feel like they can regulate the product. Similarly, banks can collaborate with others and offer their customers products that looks like insurance products. So the banking regulators couldn't regulate it. So I wonder whether you have a view on whether those maneuver on the regulatory side, such as merging different regulatory bodies, is a solution to those problems, or could it make the problem worse? Like whether you have a view on whether this mergers like this helpful or not.
Well, I think we all agree, especially after the great financial crisis, that regulations are important, and banks need to be of course they need to be regulated. So the challenge, I think, for regulators is, and it reminds me of when I first came to Columbia, there was a professor, Diaz Alejandro, teaching there, who wrote this classic article, something like hello financial deregulation, hello financial crisis, something of that order. So the notion that
goodbye financial repression,
yeah.
Hello financial panic.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So the notion there is that the moment you deregulate and don't completely, you still allow some regulations to be in place, you create arbitrage opportunities, which create speculation in black markets and shadow markets, and then you're in for a problem with financial stability. The problem for Chinese regulators isn't in part it is deregulation, because they have done some deregulation with interest rate ceilings, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is in China, financial innovation. That the financial sector is incredibly smart, fast, like Ant Financial, and regulators are running to keep a pace with the innovation. And if you think about it, that's basically the same as saying you're deregulated. And so I would in the situation you've just described, with the combination of insurance with banking regulation, if they feel that allows them to get a better handle on the shadow banking sector in a regulatory sense, then I would say caution is quite wise. I mean, you can always, hopefully you can tinker with it, and the Chinese authorities are very good at this notion of tinkering and figuring things out over time. They're extremely good at that. But I would say it seems like a reasonable thing to do.
Speaking of financial innovation, one audience member asked for your insight on cryptocurrency transactions. Whether there are a lot of Chinese are trading in cryptocurrencies, and some of the Chinese firms actually specializing in doing so-called mining. So I wonder whether you have a view on whether this helps investors in enhancing their returns or not, whether they create additional source of financial instability that one should be watching out for or not.
Yeah, I think cryptocurrencies are probably something that the People's Bank of China will take a very careful look at, because it raises questions about control, basically questions about who creates the money supply, and financial stability, and reserve requirements, all of these questions. And I just, although I've been looking at that press too, and I see a lot of articles written about cryptocurrencies in China, given what the authorities have done in given what they've done in shadow banking to all the peer-to-peer lenders, 4,000 peer-to-peer lenders, sort of like let 100 flowers bloom, and then let's do all the weeding. Let's get rid of all the weeds. And that happened with peer-to-peer lending, and I'm sure it will happen.
There are only 6 left. 6 peer-to-peer lenders are left.
Yes. So this is exactly what will happen with cryptocurrency. They'll allow the industry to sort of innovate, do some things, but then consolidate, heavily regulate, and basically control. And that's just not true of China. I think that's true of any central bank around the world. Will very much want to have a heavy involvement because it touches really at the heart of monetary policy and monetary control and financial stability and so on and so forth. These are my thoughts. I don't know. What do you think, Shang-Jin? You're sort of an expert, I think, in this.
Well, the Chinese central bank that doesn't just watch the cryptocurrency on the sideline. I mean, one of the things they have done recently is to experiment their own version of cryptocurrency. Of course, it's not called cryptocurrency. It's called DCEP, digital currency and electronic payment. I'm not sure DCEP is the right acronym I would advise them to have because it sounds like a decept something, but that's the name they choose for their digital currency, and it's central bank managed. It's not based on blockchain, but it's digital. So I wonder whether you have, and they just finished a experimentation in Shenzhen, I think something like 10 days ago, like very recent experimentation. So I wonder whether you have a view on central bank moving towards digital type of currency in an economy like China. Is it going to be a significant event for China? Is it going to be a competitor for US dollar, or is it going to be a non-event?
I think the Chinese are, my view is they're onto something. This is a new technology and the authorities will control it. And they're almost already there with mobile payments. As you know, when you go to China, there's no one who uses, I couldn't use cash anymore, basically. I couldn't even ride the metro system because I didn't have the right app on my phone. So they're virtually there with mobile payments. And it's probably just, to exaggerate a little bit, it's just probably a few more lines of code they have to write to get there. So I think they're going to roll it out and try to be a leader in this area. As a big economy, they can do this.
Is it going to be good, or is it going to be a significant event if China move to digital central bank currency?
It's going to be a good thing, but you know, and these are my own views, not as an economist, but as an individual. What cryptocurrencies have been vaunted, the thing they've been vaunted for is the provision of privacy, that no one can trace transactions. Well, that won't be the case with China's cryptocurrency. The whole point will be to trace transactions, to understand where the economy is going and who's making what kinds of transactions. So that becomes a political question, and you know, these are more difficult questions.
So back to the major drivers of growth rate in the overall framework of your books. The Chinese authorities have also just announced, I think you also mentioned about longer term growth targets. You know, it has announced a vision for what Chinese economy should look like by 2025 and what it should look like by 2035. I think the two targets were, you know, one is to cross the threshold to become a developed countries as defined by World Bank, having something like $12,000 per capita income, and by 2035 to become a you know, mid-level developed country, like an average OECD country. So I want to ask you, using the framework you have in mind, whether those targets are achievable or not, A, and B, what kind of reforms China have to do in order to become first crossing the threshold into a high-income country club, and then become, you know, a middle-level high-income countries.
Yeah, I actually have in the chapter, I believe it's on fiscal policy, I have a sort of a framework for talking about, and basically I think China's goal is to become a developed economy with sustainable growth, right? So I categorize growth into three different phases: basic growth, something like advanced growth, and then sustainable growth, which is where we consider the United States and European economies to be, where you have a middle class society. And how do you get there? And China is already well into the middle phase, right? Where The middle phase basically requires a high level of investment, a high level of savings, importantly, political stability. Even to get basic growth, I think you need political stability, and China has achieved that. But to get to advanced growth, you need some other ingredients. And China has some of those, and some of those it's still working on. So what are some of the things that you need? You need top universities. You need a legal system that works. You need you need a good regulatory framework. So you need what I call the software of growth. China's done a great job building together the hardware of growth. But what about the software? And the software involves the judicial system, how firms are financed, a strong financial system, of course. There's a vast literature on finance and economics and the role of the strength of the financial system. So that's another area, and I added a chapter for that. That's one of the reasons I added a chapter on China's financial system, because if China really wants to get there, there's still has a long way to go in terms of financial reform, the legal system, the regulatory framework, all the software still needs a lot of work. They've crushed the hardware.
In your view, would China get there in terms of advancing the software area development? Like, could China actually reach those income targets as announced, including, of course, along the way, doing all those software kind of improvements that you just explained?
Well, they certainly could. I don't know if they will.
What give you concern? What give you cause?
I think still the regulatory framework is still very interventionist. The monetary system, how finance is channeled. There's this large swath of free market sort of finance, but then there's still this regulated financial sector. So basically, I think these are some of the areas that China still needs a lot of work in. And the legal framework, both for protecting property rights, protecting again, the example of Ant Financial comes back to the example of Ant Financial. So the question is, was that an economic decision, or was that a political decision about Ant becoming too powerful? And those types of decisions can, if you create that uncertainty, you're always going to have a drag on growth. So if China can sort of find its own way in straightening these things out, then absolutely yes. The Chinese, I think you saw in the textbook, I love the Chinese people. And so I have tremendous faith in the Chinese people. That is without doubt. So I wish them the best.
Great. On this note, let me say I enjoy my conversation with Professor Ron Schramm. I hope our audience does too. So thank you very much, Ron. And let me also thank our audience for participating in today's event.